The cardiac monitor's steady beeping filled the silence as I lay in the hospital bed, my abdomen still tender from the emergency surgery just hours before. My phone showed 17 missed calls from work, but none from my husband Nathan. The nurse who'd been checking on me every hour had vanished, and when I asked the charge nurse about Victoria Kane, her expression shifted uncomfortably. She called in sick for the rest of the week, she said, avoiding my eyes. That's when I knew. My marriage was over, but Nathan had no idea that I'd been 3 steps ahead of him for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Claire Donovan, though for the past 6 years I'd been Claire Cross. I'm a pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at Riverside General Hospital in Portland, Oregon, and I thought I had built the perfect life. Our marriage was the envy of the medical community, the brilliant surgeon and the charismatic hospital administrator who'd modernized our facility's operations. We lived in a stunning Victorian home in Beacon Heights, entertained regularly, and appeared to be the golden couple of Portland's medical elite. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days repairing children's hearts while my own was slowly breaking. The signs had been there for months, maybe even years, but I'd been too busy saving lives to notice my own was falling apart. Nathan had always been charming, the kind of man who could convince anyone of anything. He'd convinced me to marry him after a whirlwind courtship, convinced me to merge my savings with his investments, convinced me that his family's initial coldness would eventually warm into acceptance. I met Nathan during my residency 7 years ago. I was exhausted, living on coffee and determination, working 100-hour weeks to prove myself in a male-dominated specialty. Nathan was already established then, having joined Riverside General as assistant administrator straight from his MBA program at Northwestern. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never having to prove yourself, the easy smile of someone who'd never been turned away from anything he wanted. Our first encounter was in the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m. I was grabbing a sandwich between surgeries, still in scrubs, my hair falling out of its ponytail. Nathan was there reviewing quarterly reports, even at that ungodly hour, dressed in a perfectly pressed shirt despite the late hour. He looked up when I dropped my surgical notes, scattering them across the floor. "Long night?" he asked, helping me gather the papers. His fingers brushed mine as he handed back a patient chart, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine attraction to someone who understood the demands of hospital life. 36 hours straight, I admitted, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. Emergency surgery on a 7-year-old with a complex congenital defect. Dr. Claire Donovan, he said, reading my name from the chart. I've heard about you. The new surgeon who's making waves in pediatric cardiac. How's the patient? The fact that he knew my work, that he asked about my patient rather than complimenting my appearance, should have been my first clue about Nathan's calculating nature. But I was tired, lonely, and flattered that someone in hospital administration knew who I was. She'll be fine, I said, allowing myself a rare smile. Thanks to a team of incredible people who don't mind losing sleep for a good cause. Nathan Cross, he introduced himself, extending his hand. And I happen to know that team follows your lead. The nursing staff talks about how you remember everyone's names, how you never lose your temper even during the most stressful procedures. That conversation led to coffee the next day, which led to dinner the following week, which led to a relationship that felt like the missing piece I hadn't realized I needed. Nathan understood the demands of my career because he lived in the same world. He didn't complain when I was called away for emergencies, didn't pout when I worked holidays, didn't make me feel guilty for choosing my patients over social obligations. What I didn't understand then was that Nathan was building a profile of me, learning what made me tick, what I valued, what I feared. He was conducting a long-term study in Claire Donovan, and I was a willing subject. The proposal came 18 months later, during a weekend trip to the Mount Hood cabin that belonged to his family. It was picture perfect, snow falling softly outside, fire crackling in the stone fireplace, my favorite wine breathing on the coffee table. Nathan had planned everything meticulously, down to having my favorite playlist streaming softly in the background. "Claire," he said, dropping to one knee as I turned from the window where I'd been watching the snow dust the pine trees. "You've changed everything about how I see the future. I want to build something lasting with you, something as strong as those hearts you repair every day. The ring was perfect, a classic solitaire that caught the firelight, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. Later, I learned that Nathan had asked my surgical coordinator about my preferences, had studied my Pinterest board, had interviewed my friends about what I might like. At the time, I thought it showed how much attention he paid to details. Now I know it showed how much he controlled every variable. The wedding was elegant, but not ostentatious, held at the Portland Art Museum, with a reception that showcased Nathan's connections throughout the city. His parents, Helen and Robert Cross, had initially been skeptical of their son marrying a surgeon from Colorado with no family money, but they'd warmed to the idea once they realized how my reputation enhanced their social standing. Helen Cross was the kind of woman who'd never worked a day in her life, but somehow stayed busy managing charity boards and organizing fundraisers for causes she'd never personally experienced. She had opinions about everything and the financial means to enforce them. Robert Cross was a retired federal judge whose word had been law for 30 years, and he expected the same deference in his personal life that he'd commanded in his courtroom. "Welcome to the family, dear," Helen had said at our engagement party, air-kissing both my cheeks while managing to avoid actual contact. "Nathan has told us so much about your little medical practice." My little medical practice. As if saving children's lives was a hobby I'd picked up to pass the time. The first year of marriage was blissful, or at least I thought it was. Nathan handled all our finances, saying it made sense since he had the business background and I was too busy with surgeries to manage investments properly. I was happy to let him take care of the details while I focused on my patients. We opened joint accounts, consolidated our assets, and I signed papers that Nathan assured me were standard married couple financial planning. "Trust me," he would say whenever I asked questions about our investments or insurance policies. "This is what I do for a living. Let me handle the boring stuff so you can focus on what you do best." I should have paid more attention to those papers. I should have asked more questions, but I was working 60-hour weeks, building my reputation, trying to balance the demands of marriage with the intensity of pediatric surgery. Nathan made it easy to let him handle everything else. The changes started small. Nathan would schedule dinner parties without consulting me, then act hurt when I couldn't attend due to emergency surgeries. He'd make plans for us to attend cross-family events, then mention casually that perhaps I could adjust my surgical schedule to accommodate them. "My mother is really looking forward to having you at the charity auction," he'd say, his tone perfectly reasonable. "She's been telling everyone about her surgeon daughter-in-law. It would mean a lot to the family if you could be there." When I explained that I couldn't reschedule a surgery on a child with a life-threatening condition for a social event, Nathan would nod understandingly, but I'd catch him later on the phone with his mother, his voice carrying a note of apology that suggested I was being unreasonable. The family began treating my career as a scheduling inconvenience, rather than a calling. Helen would plan elaborate weekend trips, then express disappointment when I couldn't join, because I was on call. Robert would share stories about his judge colleagues' wives, women who'd given up their careers to support their husband's advancement, their sacrifices presented as noble examples. "Of course, that was a different generation," Helen would say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Women today have so many more options. Though I do wonder how anyone manages to have a real family life with such demanding careers." The criticism was always wrapped in understanding, delivered with just enough sympathy to make me question whether I was being too sensitive. Nathan never contradicted his parents directly, but he'd offer comfort afterward, assuring me that they just needed time to understand my priorities. 2 years into our marriage, I began noticing changes in Nathan's behavior. He'd always been social, but now he seemed to be networking constantly, staying late at hospital functions, taking calls at home that he'd step outside to answer. When I asked about these changes, he explained that he was positioning himself for a promotion to chief administrator. "The board is watching everything I do," he'd say, straightening his tie in our bedroom mirror. "Robert thinks I have a real shot at the position, but I need to prove I can handle the political aspects, not just the operational ones." I supported his ambitions, adjusting my own schedule when possible to attend the events that mattered to his career. I watched him work rooms full of hospital board members and community leaders, saw how effortlessly he connected with people, how he made everyone feel like the most important person in the conversation. Nathan was genuinely gifted at reading people and giving them what they wanted to hear. What I failed to recognize was that this same skill was being used on me. The distance between us grew gradually. Nathan would come home later, leave earlier, spend weekends at the office or visiting his parents. When I suggested we plan a vacation, he'd agree enthusiastically but then find reasons to postpone it. When I tried to initiate intimate conversations about our future, our plans for children, our dreams, he'd listen attentively but somehow redirect the discussion to more immediate concerns. "Let's get through my promotion first," he'd say, pulling me close. "Once I'm chief administrator, we'll have more stability, more time to focus on us. I want to be able to give you everything you deserve." I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that I'd misjudged the most important relationship in my life. I threw myself deeper into my work, accepting additional surgeries, volunteering for research projects, anything that would fill the growing emptiness at home. That's when Victoria Kane entered our lives. Victoria was hired as a cardiac ICU nurse 3 years ago, fresh from nursing school, but with impressive credentials and recommendations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She was beautiful in that effortless way that made other women feel frumpy by comparison. Long auburn hair that somehow stayed perfect, even during 12-hour shifts, green eyes that seemed to see everything, a smile that could charm patients, families, and apparently, married administrators. I first noticed Nathan paying attention to Victoria during a post-operative briefing. He'd attended these meetings for years, usually reviewing his tablet or checking his phone while the medical team discussed patient care. But when Victoria spoke about her patient assessment, Nathan's full attention was focused on her, his expression interested in a way that went beyond professional courtesy. "Impressive new nurse," he commented later as we drove home. "Very thorough in her documentation." At the time, I agreed. Victoria was an excellent nurse, skilled with patients, quick to learn new procedures, the kind of team member who made everyone's job easier. If Nathan had noticed her competence, it spoke well of his attention to hospital operations. I didn't think about it again until I began noticing other small changes. Nathan started attending more medical staff meetings, involving himself in discussions about nursing protocols and patient care standards that had never interested him before. He'd mentioned Victoria's insights about workflow improvements, her suggestions for better communication between departments. "She has a really good understanding of the business side of healthcare," he'd say. "Not many nurses think about operational efficiency the way she does." The compliments were always professional, always framed in terms of hospital improvement. But I began noticing how often Victoria's name came up in Nathan's conversations, how he seemed to know details about her background, her training, her career goals. 6 months ago, everything changed. I was reviewing surgical schedules in my office when Victoria knocked on my door, holding a patient chart and wearing an expression of concern that seemed oddly theatrical. "Dr. Cross," she said, using my married name, though most of the medical staff called me Dr. Donovan. "I wanted to discuss Mrs. Patterson's post-operative care plan with you." We spent 20 minutes going over the patient's condition, medication schedule, and recovery timeline. Victoria asked thoughtful questions, took detailed notes, and demonstrated exactly the kind of clinical engagement I appreciated in nursing staff. But as she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "but your husband speaks about you with such admiration. He's so proud of your work, your reputation. You're lucky to have someone who understands the demands of what we do." The comment felt strange, too personal for our professional relationship, but I smiled and thanked her. It was only later that I realized how Victoria had positioned herself in the conversation, not as an employee discussing my husband, but as someone who had intimate knowledge of Nathan's feelings about me. That evening, I mentioned Victoria's comment to Nathan. His reaction was swift and uncomfortable, a flush creeping up his neck as he set down his wine glass. "She said that?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "That's inappropriate. I'll have to speak with her about maintaining professional boundaries." but Nathan didn't seem angry about the boundary violation. He seemed worried about what Victoria had revealed. I began paying closer attention to the dynamics around the hospital. Victoria always seemed to be present during Nathan's visits to the cardiac unit. They'd stand close together while reviewing charts, their conversations intense and focused. Other staff members had begun treating Victoria differently, deferring to her opinions, including her in discussions that typically involved more senior nurses. 3 months ago, I discovered why. I was working late in my office, finishing surgical notes, when I decided to grab coffee from the break room near Nathan's office. As I approached, I heard voices through his partially open door. Nathan's familiar baritone and Victoria's softer tone, their conversation intimate in a way that made my stomach clench. "The timeline needs to be perfect," Nathan was saying. "Everything has to look completely natural, completely justified." "I understand," Victoria replied. "But what about Claire?" "She's not stupid, Nathan. She's going to figure this out eventually." "Claire sees what she wants to see," Nathan said, and the casual dismissal in his voice hit me like a physical blow. "She's so focused on her surgeries, her reputation, she doesn't pay attention to anything else. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to do anything about it." I pressed myself against the wall, hardly breathing, as their conversation continued. "The accounts are already being restructured," Nathan continued. "Robert's been helping with the legal framework. The promotion will go through next month, and then we can move to the final phase." "And you're sure about the medical documentation?" Victoria asked. "That's your area of expertise," Nathan replied. "But yes, I'm confident. One incident, properly documented, and her surgical privileges will be suspended pending investigation. By the time the review is complete, I'll have grounds for divorce based on her instability and career implosion." I understood then that I wasn't just losing my husband. I was being systematically destroyed. Nathan and Victoria weren't just having an affair. They were orchestrating my professional and personal ruin. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Victoria's presence at my surgeries, her questions about my decision-making processes, her careful documentation of every interaction, Nathan's sudden interest in medical protocols, his questions about surgical complications, his meetings with hospital board members. They were building a case against me, creating a narrative of an unstable surgeon whose personal problems were affecting her professional judgment. And when that narrative was complete, Nathan would emerge as the victim of a marriage to a woman who'd become a liability to the hospital's reputation. I stood in that hallway for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, processing the magnitude of their betrayal. Then I walked calmly back to my office, closed the door, and began planning my own strategy. If Nathan wanted to play games with documentation and financial manipulation, he'd chosen the wrong opponent. I might have been naive about his character, but I wasn't stupid about protecting myself. And unlike Nathan, I had something he'd never possessed: genuine allies who respected my work and my integrity. The next morning, I called my friend Zoe Parker, a family law attorney I'd known since medical school. We met for coffee at a shop far from the hospital, somewhere I was certain Nathan wouldn't accidentally encounter us. "I need to ask you some hypothetical questions," I told Zoe, stirring sugar into my latte with hands that trembled slightly. "About asset protection and evidence gathering." Zoe studied my face with the sharp attention that had made her one of Portland's most successful divorce attorneys. "How hypothetical are we talking, Claire?" "Not very," I admitted, "but I need to be smart about this. I need to understand my options before I make any moves." Over the next hour, Zoe outlined strategies for protecting assets, documenting evidence of infidelity and financial misconduct, and building a case for divorce that would leave me in the strongest possible position. She also gave me the names of private investigators, forensic accountants, and other professionals who specialized in complex divorce cases. "The most important thing," Zoe emphasized, "is that you can't let them know you're onto them. If they suspect you're building a case, they'll accelerate their timeline and destroy evidence. You need to be the perfect, oblivious wife while you gather everything you need." For the past 3 months, that's exactly what I've been. I've maintained my surgical schedule, attended cross-family events, smiled at hospital functions where Nathan and Victoria played their careful game of professional distance while exchanging looks that spoke volumes. But I've also been busy. I've documented every interaction between Nathan and Victoria, photographed financial documents left carelessly on Nathan's desk, and recorded conversations using an app Zoe recommended. I've transferred funds from our joint accounts to individual accounts Nathan doesn't know about, citing investment opportunities that require quick action. I've gathered evidence of Nathan's affair, his financial manipulation, and his conspiracy to destroy my career. Most importantly, I've been building my own network of allies within the hospital. Dr. Marcus Webb, our chief of staff, has become a mentor and advocate. The nursing supervisors have expressed strong support for my work and my character. The hospital board has twice commended my contributions to the pediatric program. While Nathan and Victoria have been plotting my downfall, I've been securing my position and documenting their crimes. The emergency surgery that brought everything to a head happened last Tuesday. I was at home, enjoying a rare evening off, when my pager went off with a level 1 trauma alert. A 6-year-old had been hit by a car and was coming in with massive chest trauma and a probable cardiac injury. I threw on scrubs and drove to the hospital, calling ahead to alert the surgical team. Nathan was at a hospital board dinner that evening, an event I'd been invited to but declined in favor of staying home to catch up on medical journals. As I rushed into the hospital, I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency surgery, the clarity of purpose, the focus that blocked out everything except the task at hand. The surgery lasted 7 hours. The child's injuries were extensive, requiring delicate repair of a torn ventricle and reconstruction of damaged arteries. It was the kind of complex procedure that demanded every ounce of skill and experience I possessed, the reason I'd chosen pediatric cardiac surgery despite the demands and pressures. We saved her life. As I watched the monitors show strong, steady heartbeats from the tiny heart I'd just repaired, I felt the familiar satisfaction of a successful outcome. The surgical team was exhausted, but euphoric, the kind of high that comes from snatching a child back from death's door. It was during the post-operative period, as I was monitoring the patient's condition, that the abdominal pain started. Sharp, sudden, and severe enough to make me pause in my charting. I attributed it to stress and adrenaline, the aftermath of a difficult surgery combined with too many hours without food. But the pain worsened over the next hour, radiating from my right side with an intensity that made me nauseous. Victoria was working that night, assigned to our cardiac ICU, and she noticed my discomfort as I reviewed the patient's post-operative orders. "Dr. Cross," she said, her voice filled with professional concern that now seems perfectly calculated, "you look pale. Are you feeling all right?" I explained about the abdominal pain, thinking it might be stress-related or perhaps something I'd eaten. Victoria listened carefully, asked appropriate questions about the location and intensity of the pain, and suggested I should be examined. "It could be appendicitis," she said, her nursing assessment sounding completely reasonable. "The symptoms fit, and you've been under tremendous stress lately. Why don't I call Dr. Martinez from emergency to take a look?" Dr. Martinez confirmed Victoria's assessment. My white blood cell count was elevated, the physical examination suggested appendicitis, and he recommended immediate surgery. As they prepared me for the procedure, Victoria stayed close, helping with the preparations, offering reassurance, playing the role of concerned colleague perfectly. "I'll call Nathan," she offered as they wheeled me toward the operating room. "You should be here for this." I nodded gratefully, touched by her thoughtfulness, still completely unaware that I was being maneuvered into position for the final phase of their plan. The appendectomy went smoothly, performed by Dr. Martinez with his usual skill. I woke up in recovery, feeling groggy but relieved. The sharp pain replaced by the manageable discomfort of surgical incisions. My first thought was for my young patient, and the nurses assured me she was stable and recovering well. My second thought was for Nathan. Where was my husband? "He's been called," the recovery nurse told me when I asked. "I'm sure he'll be here soon." But Nathan didn't come. Hours passed, and my husband, the man who was supposed to love and support me, who'd promised to be there in sickness and health, never appeared. Victoria had called in sick, I was told, feeling unwell and unable to work her shift. It was then, lying in that hospital bed with my phone, showing those 17 missed calls from work but none from my husband, that I fully understood the scope of their betrayal. They'd used my emergency surgery as an opportunity to disappear together, probably thinking I'd be too medicated and distracted to notice their absence. But I noticed everything. And more importantly, I was ready for it. Because while Nathan and Victoria had been planning my destruction, I'd been planning my liberation. And tomorrow, when they returned from whatever romantic getaway they'd stolen while I lay recovering from surgery, they were going to discover that the woman they'd underestimated had just dismantled their entire world. The cardiac monitor continued its steady beeping as I reached for my phone and opened the banking app that would show Nathan exactly what happened when you abandoned the wrong woman at the hospital. Part 2. The Build-Up and Warning Signs. The morning after my appendectomy, Dr. Webb stopped by my room during his rounds. His weathered face showed genuine concern as he reviewed my chart, his gray hair slightly disheveled from what I assumed had been a long night in the emergency department. "How are you feeling, Claire?" he asked, pulling up the visitor's chair beside my bed. "That was quite a scare. Dr. Martinez said you were in considerable pain when you came in." "Much better now," I replied, though my abdomen still ached with each breath. "I'm more worried about the Patterson girl. How is she doing?" Dr. Webb smiled, the kind of expression that transformed his usually stern features. "Stable and improving. You did remarkable work under pressure, as always. Her parents wanted me to tell you they're grateful beyond words." We talked about my patient's recovery timeline and the post-operative care plan. It felt good to focus on medicine, on the clear-cut world of diagnosis and treatment, where problems had solutions and dedication produced results. Dr. Webb was preparing to leave when he paused at the door. "Claire, I have to ask, where's Nathan?" "I expected to see him here with you." The question hung in the air between us. I could have made excuses, could have protected Nathan's reputation the way I'd been doing for months. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. "I don't know," I said quietly. Victoria Kane called him, but he never came. Dr. Webb's expression shifted, concern deepening into something that looked like understanding. He'd been chief of staff for 15 years, had seen enough hospital politics and personal dramas to recognize the signs. He returned to the chair, settling in with the deliberate movement of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "Claire, can I speak frankly with you?" When I nodded, he continued, "I've noticed some concerning dynamics lately. Nathan's increased involvement in medical decisions that are outside his administrative purview. Victoria Kane's rapid advancement in influence despite her limited experience. And you've seemed more isolated lately, more guarded." My throat tightened. Dr. Webb had noticed what I'd hoped was invisible, the gradual erosion of my standing within the hospital hierarchy. "I'm fine, Marcus. Just focused on my work. Your work is exemplary, as always, but I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone is being systematically undermined." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. "I want you to know that your position here is secure. Your skills, your character, your contributions to this hospital, they speak for themselves. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After Dr. Webb left, I lay in the hospital bed, thinking about his words. He'd seen through the careful manipulation that Nathan and Victoria thought was invisible. If Dr. Webb had noticed, others probably had too. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant I wasn't paranoid. Terrifying because it confirmed how precarious my situation had become. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nathan. "Just heard about your surgery. Sorry I couldn't get there last night. Family emergency with mother. Coming by this afternoon." The lie was so casual, so easily delivered, that I felt physically sick. There had been no family emergency. Helen Cross had posted photos from her book club meeting on social media just hours earlier. When Nathan finally appeared that afternoon, he arrived with an elaborate bouquet of white lilies and an expression of concerned devotion that would have been convincing if I hadn't known better. He'd showered recently. His hair was still slightly damp, and he smelled faintly of unfamiliar perfume that definitely wasn't mine. "Sweetheart," he said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. Mother had chest pains, and we had to rush her to the emergency room." False alarm. Thank God, but you know how she gets. The performance was flawless, the right amount of worry, the perfect balance of guilt and explanation. Nathan had always been gifted at reading people, at knowing exactly what they needed to hear. But I'd learned to read him too, and I could see the calculation behind his concern. "Of course," I replied, accepting his kiss and managing a weak smile. "How is Helen feeling now?" "Much better. Just stressed from the charity board reorganization. You know how seriously she takes her responsibilities." Nathan settled into the visitor's chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "The important thing is that you're okay." Dr. Martinez said the surgery went perfectly. We talked for an hour about my recovery, about hospital matters, about his mother's imaginary health scare. Nathan was attentive and charming, holding my hand and stroking my hair, playing the devoted husband role with Academy Award precision. But I noticed things I'd missed before. How he checked his phone constantly, how his attention seemed divided, how he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. Victoria appeared just as visiting hours were ending, still in her scrubs from the previous shift she'd supposedly missed due to illness. Her timing was perfect, late enough to avoid overlapping with other visitors, early enough to seem like a concerned colleague checking on a supervisor. "Dr. Cross," she said, her voice filled with professional warmth. "I wanted to see how you were recovering. I felt terrible about calling in sick when you needed support staff." Nathan's reaction was subtle but telling. He straightened slightly, his grip on my hand loosening as Victoria entered the room. They didn't look at each other directly, but I could feel the energy between them, the careful awareness of two people pretending not to be intimately connected. "That's very thoughtful, Victoria," I replied, watching both their faces. "I hope you're feeling better." "Much better, thank you. Just a 24-hour bug." She moved to check my IV line with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle and professional. "Your post-operative vitals look excellent. Doctor Martinez does beautiful work." The three of us chatted about my recovery timeline and return to work schedule. Victoria asked intelligent questions about my comfort level and pain management, demonstrating exactly the kind of clinical knowledge that made her such an effective nurse. Nathan contributed thoughtful comments about hospital protocols and administrative considerations for my medical leave. It was a perfectly normal interaction between a patient, her husband, and a concerned colleague. Except for the undercurrent of tension that ran beneath every word, the careful choreography of two people desperately trying not to reveal their connection while maintaining their professional facades. After Victoria left, Nathan stayed another hour, but his presence felt different, distracted, performative. He kept mentioning how tired he was from the stress of his mother's health scare, how he needed to get home early to catch up on sleep. When he finally left, he kissed me goodbye with lips that tasted faintly of Victoria's strawberry lip balm. That night, alone in my hospital room, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Zoe Parker and asked her to come see me the next morning, telling her it was time to move from planning to action. Zoe arrived early, before the morning shift change, carrying a briefcase and wearing the focused expression she reserved for her most important cases. She pulled the visitor's chair close to my bed and leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me everything," she said. "And I mean everything. No detail is too small." For the next 2 hours, I laid out the complete picture of Nathan's betrayal. The financial manipulation I'd discovered, the evidence of his affair with Victoria, the conspiracy to undermine my career, and the deliberate abandonment during my medical emergency. Zoe took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "This is worse than I thought," she said when I finished. "Nathan isn't just cheating. He's committing multiple felonies. The financial fraud alone could land him in prison. Add in the conspiracy to damage your professional reputation, and we're looking at a pattern of criminal behavior." She outlined the evidence we'd need to build an airtight case: financial records, communication logs, witness statements, and documentation of the affair. Most importantly, she emphasized the need for secrecy until we were ready to move. "Nathan thinks he's controlling the narrative," Zoe explained. "He believes you're the naive wife who doesn't pay attention to finances or hospital politics. We need to let him keep thinking that while we build our case. When we're ready to act, it needs to be swift and devastating." Over the following weeks, as I recovered from surgery and returned to work, I became a woman living a double life. Publicly, I was the dedicated surgeon focused on her patients, the loving wife supporting her husband's career ambitions. Privately, I was conducting a forensic investigation into my own marriage. Nathan's promotion to chief administrator was announced 2 weeks after my surgery. The hospital board praised his vision for operational efficiency and his deep understanding of both medical and business aspects of healthcare management. At the celebratory dinner, Nathan gave a speech thanking his family, his colleagues, and especially his wife for her unwavering support. "Claire has shown me what dedication really means," he said, raising his champagne glass toward me. "Her commitment to healing children, her grace under pressure, her ability to balance the demands of a challenging career with the support of those she loves. She's my inspiration and my anchor." The applause was warm and genuine. These people respected me, valued my contributions, saw Nathan and me as a power couple who strengthened each other. If they only knew that the man praising my dedication was systematically destroying my life, they would have been shocked. But I smiled and accepted their congratulations, played the proud wife celebrating her husband's success. Inside, I was cataloging every word of Nathan's speech, every gesture, every interaction with Victoria, who was serving as part of the catering staff for the evening. Victoria had volunteered to work the event, claiming she wanted to contribute to Nathan's special day. She moved through the crowd with professional efficiency, refilling drinks and clearing plates, invisible to most of the guests. But I watched her carefully, noting how she lingered near Nathan when possible, how they managed brief eye contact across the room, how she seemed to anticipate his needs without being asked. After the dinner, as we drove home through the quiet Portland streets, Nathan was euphoric. He talked excitedly about his plans for the hospital, the changes he wanted to implement, the board members he needed to cultivate for future support. "This is just the beginning," he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "With this position, I can really make a difference. And having you by my side makes it all possible." His words should have filled me with pride. Instead, they made me sad for the woman I'd been 6 months earlier, the woman who would have believed his sincerity and felt grateful for his appreciation. Now I understood that Nathan's success was built on my foundation, my reputation, my connections, my credibility within the medical community. He'd used me to establish himself, and now he was preparing to discard me. The evidence continued to accumulate over the following month. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. Credit card bills for hotel rooms and restaurant meals on days when Nathan claimed to be working late. Text messages between Nathan and Victoria that had become increasingly careless as they grew more confident in their deception. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Patricia Woods, one of the senior nurses in cardiac surgery, approached me one afternoon with obvious reluctance and embarrassment. "Dr. Donovan," she said, using my maiden name as most of the nursing staff did, "I need to speak with you about something, and I'm not sure how to approach it." We found privacy in my office, where Patricia sat rigidly in the chair across from my desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd worked in cardiac surgery for 20 years, had seen me through my early days as an attending physician, and I respected her judgment and discretion. "There's been talk," she began carefully, "about you and your husband, about your marriage. The other nurses are concerned about you." My heart began racing, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of talk, Patricia?" "Victoria Kane has been making comments about your stability, your decision-making, your ability to handle stress. She's been suggesting that your recent surgery was stress-related, that you're showing signs of burnout." The room felt suddenly cold. This was exactly what Nathan and Victoria had planned, a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine my reputation through gossip and innuendo. "She's also been talking about Mr. Cross," Patricia continued, her voice dropping even lower, "about how difficult it must be for him to watch his wife struggle with the demands of her career, how supportive he's been despite the strain on their marriage." I felt sick, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Has she said anything specific about my performance or patient care?" "Not directly. But she's been documenting everything. Every time you seem tired, every time you delegate a task, every time you leave early or arrive late. She's building a file, Dr. Donovan. And she's been sharing her concerns with Mr. Cross." Patricia leaned forward, her expression earnest. "The nursing staff knows what's really happening. We see how hard you work, how much you care about your patients. We see the quality of your surgeries and the outcomes you achieve. What Victoria is doing, it's not right." After Patricia left, I sat in my office for a long time, processing the implications of what she'd told me. Nathan and Victoria weren't just planning to destroy my marriage. They were systematically undermining my professional reputation, creating a documented pattern of alleged instability that would justify my removal from the surgical staff. But they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd assumed that the nursing staff would go along with Victoria's campaign, that professional jealousy or personal ambition would make them complicit in my destruction. Instead, they'd created a group of allies who were actively documenting Victoria's misconduct and Nathan's abuse of his administrative position. That evening, I called Zoe with an update on the situation. Her response was immediate and decisive. "We need to move faster than planned," she said. "If they're building a professional case against you, we can't wait for them to complete it. How quickly can you secure the financial evidence we discussed?" "I can have everything within 48 hours, I replied. "Nathan keeps all the important documents in his home office, and he's traveling to a conference this weekend." "Perfect. While he's gone, we'll document everything. And Claire, it's time to start protecting yourself financially. Transfer what you can to secured accounts, but do it in a way that looks routine. We don't want to tip them off before we're ready." The next morning, Nathan left for a 3-day hospital administration conference in Seattle. He kissed me goodbye at the door, reminding me to call if I needed anything, promising to bring me back something special from Pike Place Market. His performance of devoted husband was flawless, right up until his car disappeared around the corner. Victoria had also requested time off for the same weekend, claiming she needed to visit her sick grandmother in Eugene. The coincidence would have been laughable if it wasn't so calculated. As soon as Nathan's plane left Portland, I began the most important work of my life. Not surgery this time, but surgery of a different kind, carefully extracting the tumor of deception that had been growing in my marriage, documenting each malignant cell before removing it completely. By Sunday evening, when Nathan returned from his conference with a box of chocolates and stories about innovative hospital management techniques, I had everything I needed. Bank records, communication logs, financial statements, witness affidavits, and a complete timeline of their conspiracy. Nathan had no idea that while he was planning my destruction in a Seattle hotel room with Victoria Kane, I was home preparing his complete annihilation. The trap was set. All I needed now was the right moment to spring it. Part 3. The Discovery and Evidence Gathering. Dr. Webb found me in the cardiac surgery lounge, 3 weeks after Nathan's return from Seattle, sitting alone with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. I was reviewing patient charts, but my mind was elsewhere, calculating timelines and weighing options with the precision I usually reserved for surgical procedures. "You look troubled," he said, settling into the chair across from me. Something more than the usual stress of our work. I looked up at this man who'd become an unexpected mentor, whose steady presence had anchored me through the most turbulent period of my life. Dr. Webb had the kind of weathered integrity that came from decades of making life and death decisions, and I found myself trusting him with thoughts I hadn't shared with anyone except Zoe. "Marcus, can I ask you something confidential?" When he nodded, I continued. "If you discovered that someone was systematically trying to undermine a colleague's reputation through false documentation and manufactured incidents, what would you do?" His gray eyes sharpened with interest. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence of such behavior?" "Hypothetically," I said carefully. "If such evidence existed, what would be the proper channels for addressing it?" Dr. Webb studied my face for a long moment, clearly understanding that we weren't discussing hypotheticals. "The medical board has protocols for investigating allegations of professional misconduct, but such investigations require substantial documentation and witness testimony. They're not undertaken lightly." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Claire, if someone is targeting your professional reputation, you need to protect yourself immediately. Document everything, secure witness statements, and build an irrefutable case before making any formal accusations. In cases like this, you only get one chance to present your evidence." That conversation solidified my resolve to accelerate the timeline Zoe and I had established. The evidence-gathering phase needed to conclude quickly, before Nathan and Victoria realized their conspiracy had been discovered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, who worked in hospital billing, approached me after a staff meeting with information that changed everything. "Dr. Donovan," she said quietly, "I need to show you something, but not here. Can you meet me in the parking garage after your shift?" That evening, in the fluorescent-lit basement of the hospital parking structure, Janet handed me a manila folder thick with printouts and documentation. "I've been reviewing billing irregularities as part of the quarterly audit," she explained, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I found some discrepancies that involve your husband and Victoria Kane." The documents she showed me revealed a pattern of financial manipulation that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Nathan had been using his administrative access to approve overtime payments for Victoria that she'd never actually worked. He'd authorized equipment purchases for the cardiac unit that were then redirected to departments where Victoria had influence. Most damaging of all, he'd been approving medical education reimbursements for Victoria's attendance at conferences that she'd never actually attended. "This represents about $40,000 over the past 18 months, Janet said. "All of it authorized by your husband, all of it benefiting Victoria Kane directly or indirectly." But the financial fraud was just the beginning. Janet had also discovered that Nathan had been accessing patient records outside his administrative purview, specifically reviewing cases where I was the primary surgeon. He'd been studying my surgical decisions, my post-operative notes, my patient interactions, looking for any documentation that could be used to question my competence. "He's been building a file," Janet said, confirming Patricia's earlier warnings. "Every case where there were complications, every patient who required additional procedures, every family complaint or concern. He's been documenting patterns that don't actually exist." The most chilling discovery was a series of emails between Nathan and Victoria, discussing specific patients and surgical outcomes. They'd been analyzing my cases with the cold calculation of prosecutors building a criminal case, looking for ways to frame normal medical challenges as evidence of declining performance. "There's more," Janet said, handing me another folder. "Victoria has been submitting incident reports about you to risk management. Minor things, alleged medication errors, supposed communication failures, claimed documentation oversights. None of them serious enough to trigger immediate action, but together they create a pattern." I reviewed the incident reports with growing horror. Victoria had been manufacturing a fictional narrative of professional decline, using her position as a trusted nurse to create documentation that would seem credible to hospital administrators. Each report was carefully crafted to seem like legitimate concern for patient safety, while actually building a case for my removal from the surgical staff. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked Janet, overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. "Because I know who you are," she replied firmly. "I've worked here for 12 years. I've seen you save children that other surgeons said were hopeless. I've watched you work 18-hour days because a patient needed you. What they're doing, it's not just wrong, it's criminal." That night, I spread all the evidence across my dining room table like pieces of a complex puzzle. Financial records, incident reports, billing irregularities, email communications, witness statements. The complete anatomy of a conspiracy designed to destroy my life and career. Zoe arrived at 10 o'clock, bringing Chinese takeout and a team of forensic accountants she'd worked with on complex divorce cases. We spent the next 6 hours analyzing every document, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building a timeline that showed the careful orchestration of Nathan and Victoria's plot. "This is prosecution-level evidence," said David Chen, the lead forensic accountant. "The financial fraud alone constitutes multiple felonies. Add in the conspiracy to damage your professional reputation, and we're looking at potential prison time for both of them." Sarah Martinez, Zoe's paralegal, had been organizing the evidence by category and chronology. "The pattern is clear," she said, pointing to the timeline she'd created. "Every action they've taken has been designed to isolate you, undermine your credibility, and create justification for divorce proceedings that would leave you financially and professionally ruined." But the most valuable evidence came from my own careful documentation over the previous months. I'd been recording conversations, photographing documents, and maintaining detailed logs of Nathan and Victoria's interactions. Combined with the hospital records Janet had provided, We had an irrefutable case of conspiracy, fraud, and professional misconduct. The question now, Zoe said, is timing. When do we move, and how do we ensure maximum impact while protecting your interests? The answer came sooner than expected. The following Monday, Nathan announced that he'd scheduled a meeting with Dr. Webb and the hospital board for Friday afternoon. The stated purpose was to discuss personnel matters affecting patient safety in the cardiac surgery department. Patricia heard about the meeting from Dr. Webb's secretary and warned me immediately. He's going to present Victoria's incident reports, she said. He's going to recommend that you be suspended pending investigation. I felt a cold calm settle over me, the same focused clarity that came during the most challenging surgeries. Nathan had forced the timeline by accelerating his own plans. He was so confident in his conspiracy, so certain that I was oblivious to his manipulation, that he was ready to deliver the final blow. But Nathan had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that I would be a passive victim, that I would accept his narrative and quietly fade away. He'd forgotten that I was a surgeon, trained to cut away diseased tissue with precision and determination. That evening, I called Zoe with the news about Nathan's planned presentation to the hospital board. Perfect, she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a chess player who'd just seen their opponent walk into checkmate. Let him present his fabricated case. We'll be ready with the real evidence. Wednesday morning, I submitted a formal request to address the hospital board at their Friday meeting. Dr. Webb approved the request immediately, assuming I wanted to respond to whatever allegations Nathan was planning to present. Thursday evening, Nathan came home from work with an expression of barely concealed excitement. He'd been planning this moment for months, and he couldn't completely hide his anticipation of what he saw as his final victory. Claire, he said over dinner, his tone artificially somber, I need to prepare you for something difficult. There have been concerns raised about your performance in surgery. Nothing specific, just patterns that suggest you might be experiencing stress or burnout. His performance was flawless, the concerned husband forced to deliver painful news, the loving partner trying to protect his wife from harsh realities. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have been grateful for his gentle approach to what seemed like devastating news. What kind of concerns? I asked, playing the role of confused and worried wife. Documentation issues, communication problems, some questions about your decision-making under pressure. The hospital board wants to review your recent cases, just as a precaution. Nothing to worry about. These reviews happen all the time. Nathan reached across the table to take my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. I'll be there to support you through the whole process. We'll get through this together, no matter what they decide. The irony was breathtaking. Nathan was comforting me about the professional destruction he'd orchestrated, promising to support me through the crisis he'd created. His ability to lie so convincingly, to perform concern while planning betrayal, was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. That night, as Nathan slept peacefully beside me, probably dreaming of his impending triumph, I lay awake finalizing my own plans. By tomorrow evening, Nathan Cross would discover what happened when you underestimated a woman who'd spent her career making life-and-death decisions under pressure. I'd learned something important about myself during these months of deception and evidence gathering. I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resourceful than Nathan had calculated, and absolutely ruthless when protecting something I'd worked my entire life to build. Friday morning dawned clear and bright. The kind of Pacific Northwest day that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. I dressed carefully for the hospital board meeting, a navy blue suit that projected professional authority, minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in the style I wore for difficult surgeries. Nathan left for work early, claiming he needed to prepare his presentation for the board. He kissed me goodbye with what seemed like genuine affection, still maintaining his performance as the devoted husband right up until the moment of truth. At 10 o'clock, I met with Zoe, David, and Sarah in a conference room at Zoe's law firm. We spent 2 hours rehearsing my presentation, reviewing the evidence, and preparing for every possible response Nathan might attempt. Remember, Zoe said as we concluded our preparation, you're not just defending yourself today. You're exposing a criminal conspiracy and protecting other potential victims. Nathan and Victoria won't stop with you if they succeed. By 2 o'clock, I was sitting in the hospital boardroom, surrounded by people who would determine my professional future. Dr. Webb sat at the head of the polished conference table, flanked by the 6 members of Riverside General's board of directors. Nathan sat across from me, a folder of documents at his elbow, his expression appropriately grave for the serious business at hand. Victoria wasn't present. She had no official role in the proceedings, but I knew she was somewhere in the hospital, probably monitoring her phone for updates from Nathan about how their plan was unfolding. We'll begin with Mr. Cross's presentation, Dr. Webb announced, followed by Dr. Donovan's response. I want to emphasize that this is a preliminary review, not a formal disciplinary hearing. Nathan stood, adjusted his tie, and began the presentation he'd been crafting for months. His voice was measured and professional as he outlined his concerns about my recent performance. He presented Victoria's incident reports with clinical detachment, describing them as evidence of a pattern that suggested I was experiencing dangerous levels of stress and fatigue. I want to be clear, Nathan said, looking directly at me with an expression of painful regret, that I have the utmost respect for my wife's skills and dedication. But patient safety must be our primary concern, and these documented incidents suggest that Dr. Donovan may need additional support or temporary relief from her surgical responsibilities. It was a masterful performance. Nathan presented himself as the reluctant whistleblower, forced by his professional obligations to report concerns about his own wife. He emphasized his love for me, his desire to protect both me and the patients under my care, his hope that intervention now could prevent more serious problems later. The board members listened intently, asking clarifying questions about specific incidents and timelines. Nathan answered each question with apparent reluctance, as if every word pained him but duty compelled him to continue. When Nathan finished his presentation, Dr. Webb turned to me. Dr. Donovan, you have the opportunity to respond to these concerns and present any additional information you feel is relevant. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. This was my chance to expose the truth, to protect my career and reveal the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed me. I looked around the table at these people who would judge not just my professional competence but my character and integrity. Thank you, Dr. Webb, I said, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations. But before I respond to the specific incidents Mr. Cross has presented, I need to provide some context about how and why these reports were generated. I opened my own folder and withdrew the first piece of evidence, the financial records showing Nathan's fraudulent payments to Victoria Kane. Over the past 6 months, I've been investigating a conspiracy involving my husband and Victoria Kane to undermine my professional reputation and destroy my career. What you've just heard isn't a legitimate expression of concern about patient safety. It's the final phase of a carefully orchestrated campaign of fraud, defamation, and professional sabotage. The silence in the room was absolute. Nathan's face had gone pale, his confident posture crumbling as he realized that his carefully planned ambush had become his own exposure. The evidence I'm about to present, I continued, documents multiple criminal acts committed by Nathan Cross and Victoria Kane, including financial fraud, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to damage my professional reputation. These aren't allegations. They're documented facts supported by hospital records, financial statements, and recorded communications. As I began laying out the evidence, piece by piece, I watched Nathan's world collapse in real time. His expression shifted from confusion to panic to desperate calculation as he realized the scope of what I'd discovered and documented. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd systematically betrayed and manipulated, had just revealed herself to be far more formidable than he'd ever imagined. And his carefully constructed plan to destroy me had instead become the instrument of his own complete annihilation. Part 4. The Execution and Immediate Fallout. The conference room fell into stunned silence as I methodically presented each piece of evidence. Financial records showing Nathan's fraudulent authorizations. Email communications revealing the conspiracy with Victoria. Witness statements from hospital staff, audio recordings of their conversations about manufacturing incidents and building false cases against me. Nathan sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, panic, and growing desperation as the scope of my evidence became clear. This wasn't what he'd prepared for. He'd expected a defensive woman scrambling to explain away legitimate concerns about her performance. Instead, he was watching his carefully constructed conspiracy exposed in devastating detail. Dr. Webb's expression had shifted from professional concern to barely controlled fury as he reviewed the financial documents. "Mr. Cross," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "are you telling me that you've been using your administrative access to authorize fraudulent payments and manipulate hospital records?" Nathan's mouth opened and closed without sound. The confident administrator who'd walked into this meeting expecting to destroy his wife's career was gone, replaced by a man facing the complete annihilation of his professional and personal life. There must be some mistake," Nathan finally managed, his voice barely audible. "These documents have been taken out of context. I can explain everything." "I'm sure you can," said Margaret Foster, the board's legal advisor, her tone cutting. "You can explain it to the district attorney's office, which will be receiving copies of all this evidence by the end of the day." I continued my presentation, detailing how Nathan and Victoria had used their positions to gather ammunition against me while systematically stealing from the hospital. The incident reports Victoria had filed weren't expressions of legitimate concern. They were manufactured evidence designed to create a paper trail supporting my removal. "Every single one of these reports," I said, displaying Victoria's documentation on the conference room screen, "corresponds to a day when Victoria Kane was either off-duty or assigned to different departments. She wasn't even present during most of the incidents she claims to have witnessed." David Chen, my forensic accountant, had joined the meeting to present the financial analysis. His findings were damning. Nathan had stolen over $60,000 through fraudulent authorizations, fake conference reimbursements, and manipulated overtime payments. All of it had benefited Victoria directly or had been used to fund their affair. "The pattern is clear," David explained to the board. "Mr. Cross systematically abused his administrative access to enrich his mistress while building a false case against his wife. This isn't a personnel dispute. It's organized criminal activity." Throughout my presentation, Nathan made several attempts to interrupt, to offer explanations, or demand the right to respond. But each time he tried to speak, another piece of evidence contradicted his claims. The audio recordings were particularly devastating. His own voice discussing the timeline for my professional destruction, his casual dismissal of my intelligence, his confidence that I would never discover their plan. The board members asked sharp questions about the evidence, the timeline, and the methods I'd used to gather the information. Their anger was palpable, not just at Nathan's betrayal of his professional responsibilities, but at the calculated cruelty of the conspiracy against me. "Dr. Donovan," said Robert Martinez, the board chairman, "I need to ask directly, how long have you known about this conspiracy, and why didn't you come forward sooner?" It was a fair question, and one I'd prepared for. "I discovered the affair 3 months ago, but I needed time to gather evidence and understand the full scope of their plan. If I'd acted immediately, they would have destroyed evidence and accelerated their timeline. I needed irrefutable proof to protect both myself and the hospital." "Doctor?" Webb leaned forward, his expression grim. "Nathan, I'm giving you one opportunity to respond to these allegations. But I want to warn you that anything you say will be part of the official record and will be shared with law enforcement." Nathan looked around the table desperately, perhaps hoping to find a sympathetic face or an escape route. Finding neither, he seemed to collapse inward, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his exposure. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Victoria and it started innocently. We were working together on operational improvements, and we developed feelings for each other. But Claire was so focused on her work, so distant. I felt ignored in my own marriage. The justification was pathetic, blaming me for his decision to commit adultery and fraud. But Nathan wasn't finished with his excuses. The incident reports were Victoria's idea," he continued, throwing his mistress under the bus with casual betrayal. "She was concerned about some of Claire's cases, legitimately concerned. I may have let my personal feelings cloud my judgment about how to handle those concerns." "Legitimately concerned?" I interrupted, my voice sharp with anger. Victoria filed reports about incidents she never witnessed, during shifts she wasn't working, about procedures she wasn't qualified to evaluate. She manufactured evidence, Nathan. You both did. Nathan tried one more desperate gambit. Claire, please, I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. Don't destroy our marriage over professional disagreements. The audacity was breathtaking. After months of systematic betrayal, after stealing from the hospital and conspiring to destroy my career, Nathan was still trying to manipulate me into protecting him. Our marriage ended the moment you decided to betray everything we built together, I replied coldly. This isn't about professional disagreements, Nathan. This is about fraud, theft, and conspiracy. You made your choice when you decided to destroy me rather than simply asking for a divorce. The room fell silent again as the magnitude of Nathan's betrayal settled over everyone present. Margaret Foster was already making notes on her legal pad, no doubt preparing the documentation that would accompany the criminal referral to the district attorney's office. Dr. Webb stood up slowly, his weathered face showing the strain of processing what he'd just learned. Nathan Cross, your employment at Riverside General Hospital is terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the premises, and you are banned from returning to hospital property pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Nathan's face crumpled completely then, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his desperate denials. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his marriage finished, and criminal charges were imminent. The man who'd walked into this meeting expecting to orchestrate my downfall was leaving in disgrace, his own life in ruins. What about Victoria? Asked Dr. Martinez, though we all knew the answer. Ms. Kane's employment is also terminated immediately, Dr. Webb replied. Security is already retrieving her from the cardiac unit. She'll be escorted off the premises and banned from returning. As hospital security arrived to remove Nathan from the building, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This man had been my husband, someone I'd loved and trusted completely. Watching his destruction should have felt like victory, but mostly it felt like the final confirmation of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. Nathan stood up unsteadily, his expensive suit somehow looking shabby now that his world had collapsed. He looked at me one last time, his expression a mixture of hatred and disbelief, as if he still couldn't comprehend how the woman he'd dismissed as naive and distracted had outmaneuvered him so completely. This isn't over, Claire, he said as the security guards approached. You'll regret this. You have no idea what you've done to your own life. Even in defeat, Nathan was still trying to threaten and manipulate me. It was a perfect illustration of his character. Unable to accept responsibility for his actions, unwilling to acknowledge the consequences of his choices, still believing that he could intimidate me into submission. I looked at him calmly, feeling the strength that had carried me through months of deception and planning. Nathan, my life began the moment I stopped letting you control it. The only thing I regret is not seeing who you really were sooner. As Nathan was escorted from the boardroom, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I turned back to face the hospital board. These people needed to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant for the hospital's reputation and future operations. I want to assure the board, I said, that my commitment to Riverside General and to patient care remains absolute. I've documented every aspect of this conspiracy not just to protect myself, but to ensure that nothing like this can happen again. We need stronger oversight of administrative access to medical records and better protocols for investigating personnel complaints. Dr. Webb nodded approvingly. Dr. Donovan, I want to personally apologize for what you've endured. Your professionalism in handling this situation, your commitment to gathering evidence rather than making accusations, your protection of the hospital's interests throughout this ordeal. It speaks to the kind of character we value in our medical staff. The board meeting continued for another hour, as we discussed the administrative changes needed to prevent similar abuse of power. New oversight protocols for personnel investigations, stricter controls on financial authorizations, and mandatory training for administrative staff about appropriate boundaries with medical personnel. Margaret Foster explained the legal timeline we could expect. The district attorney's office would likely file charges within days, given the strength of the evidence. Both Nathan and Victoria would face multiple felony counts, including fraud, theft of public funds, and conspiracy. The hospital would also pursue civil remedies to recover the stolen money and damages. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Webb asked me to stay behind for a private conversation. When the other board members had left, he closed the conference room door and sat down across from me. "Claire," he said, using my first name with the familiarity of a mentor, "I need you to know how impressed I am with how you handled this situation. Many people would have been destroyed by what Nathan and Victoria put you through. Instead, you turned their conspiracy against them and protected the hospital in the process." I felt tears threatening for the first time since this ordeal began. The validation from someone I respected so much was overwhelming after months of feeling isolated and under attack. "I won't lie to you," Dr. Webb continued. "This scandal will generate publicity that the hospital would prefer to avoid. But your conduct throughout this situation has been exemplary, and the board unanimously supports you. We want you to know that your position here is secure, and we hope you'll consider expanding your role in hospital leadership." The offer was unexpected, but welcome. Nathan's betrayal had made me question everything about my professional relationships, wondering who else might be working against me behind the scenes. Dr. Webb's clear support and the board's confidence felt like a lifeline back to the career I loved. That afternoon, as news of Nathan's termination spread through the hospital, I experienced something I hadn't felt in months: genuine support from my colleagues. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff stopped by my office throughout the day to express their shock at what had happened, and their relief that the truth had finally come out. Patricia Woods brought me coffee and sat in my office for 20 minutes, sharing what she'd observed about Victoria's behavior over the past year. Other nurses from the cardiac unit stopped by to tell me they'd never believed Victoria's reports, that they'd known something wasn't right about her sudden influence and Nathan's favoritism. "We should have said something sooner," Patricia admitted. "But Victoria was so careful about how she presented things, and Nathan had so much authority. We didn't know how to challenge them without putting our own jobs at risk." Dr. Martinez from the emergency department came by to tell me about irregularities he'd noticed in how my cases were being reviewed and documented. He'd been suspicious of the pattern but hadn't realized it was part of a deliberate conspiracy. "I should have trusted my instincts," he said. "Your work has always been exemplary, and those incident reports never made sense to me. I'm sorry we didn't speak up sooner." The support was gratifying, but it also highlighted how isolated Nathan and Victoria's conspiracy had made me feel. For months, I'd questioned my own judgment, wondered if I was being paranoid, worried that my colleagues were losing confidence in me. Now I realized that the opposite was true. My colleagues had been concerned about what was happening to me, not convinced by the false narrative Nathan and Victoria were creating. By 5 o'clock, word had spread beyond the hospital walls. My phone was buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, legal investigators, and colleagues from other medical facilities who'd heard about the scandal. Zoe arrived at my office to help manage the media attention and coordinate with law enforcement. "The district attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow morning," she told me. "They're moving quickly on this because the evidence is so clear-cut. Nathan and Victoria will probably be arrested within 48 hours. The speed of the legal response was both satisfying and surreal. This morning, I'd walked into a hospital board meeting expecting to defend my career against false allegations. Tonight, I was coordinating with prosecutors to ensure that my husband and his mistress faced appropriate criminal charges for their conspiracy against me. Zoe and I spent the evening at my house, going through the evidence one more time and preparing for the prosecutor's questions. We also discussed the practical aspects of my situation: filing for divorce, securing my assets, changing locks, and dealing with the media attention. "Nathan's going to try to negotiate a plea deal," Zoe predicted. "He'll probably offer to testify against Victoria in exchange for reduced charges. Are you prepared for him to try to minimize his role and blame everything on her?" I'd already considered that possibility. Nathan's final attempt to throw Victoria under the bus during the board meeting had shown his willingness to sacrifice anyone to save himself. It was consistent with everything I'd learned about his character over the past few months. "Let him try," I said. "The evidence shows they were equal partners in this conspiracy. The prosecutors have recordings of Nathan planning my destruction in his own words. He can't blame that on Victoria's influence." That night, alone in the house Nathan and I had shared for 6 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering his betrayal: peace. The constant anxiety of living with deception was gone, replaced by the clarity that came from truth finally being revealed. I walked through our home, looking at the furniture we'd chosen together, the artwork we'd collected, the photographs documenting what I'd thought was a happy marriage. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of disentangling my life from Nathan's, of rebuilding on a foundation of truth rather than lies. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be free. The next morning brought a parade of legal meetings, media interviews, and administrative tasks. The district attorney's office was thorough in their questioning, but Zoe's preparation had readied me for every aspect of their investigation. The prosecutors were confident that both Nathan and Victoria would face significant prison time given the strength of the evidence. Nathan's arrest happened at his parents' house in Lake Oswego, where he'd fled after being terminated from the hospital. According to the news reports, he was taken into custody without incident, though his mother Helen was photographed screaming at the arresting officers from the front steps of their mansion. Victoria was arrested at her apartment, where police found additional evidence of the conspiracy: draft resignation letters she'd prepared for me, forged medical documents, and financial records showing how she'd spent the money Nathan had stolen for her. The local news coverage was extensive but fair, focusing on the criminal aspects of the case, rather than sensationalizing the personal betrayal. Dr. Webb had given a statement emphasizing the hospital's commitment to patient safety and professional integrity, while making it clear that my reputation and position were completely secure. My phone rang constantly with calls from colleagues, friends, and family members who'd seen the news coverage. My parents drove up from California to offer support. My brother called from Denver to express his outrage at Nathan's behavior, and medical school friends reached out to tell me they'd never liked Nathan anyway. The most meaningful call came from Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief of pediatric surgery at Oregon Health Sciences University. She'd followed my career for years and had always spoken highly of my work at medical conferences. "Claire," she said, "I want you to know that what Nathan and Victoria did to you changes nothing about how the medical community views your skills and character. If anything, the way you handled this situation shows the kind of integrity we need more of in healthcare leadership." She went on to tell me about opportunities at OHSU, research positions, and leadership roles that might interest me if I decided to make a change after everything that had happened at Riverside General. "I'm not trying to poach you," Dr. Chen said with a laugh, "but I want you to know that you have options, that your career prospects are stronger than ever, despite what these criminals tried to do to you." The validation was overwhelming. For months, I'd been living in fear that Nathan and Victoria's conspiracy would destroy my professional reputation. Instead, their exposure had generated an outpouring of support from colleagues who respected how I'd handled an impossible situation. 3 days after Nathan's arrest, Zoe received a call from his attorney requesting a meeting to discuss potential cooperation with the prosecution. Nathan was apparently willing to provide detailed testimony about Victoria's role in the conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. "He's trying to save himself by sacrificing her," Zoe explained. "But the prosecutors aren't interested in deal-making right now. They have enough evidence to convict both of them without Nathan's testimony." The irony was perfect. Nathan had betrayed me, betrayed the hospital, betrayed his professional obligations, and now he was trying to betray Victoria too. The man who'd once seemed so charming and trustworthy had revealed himself to be someone who would sacrifice anyone to protect his own interests. Victoria's attorney took a different approach, requesting a meeting to discuss her client's willingness to provide evidence about financial irregularities in other hospital departments. She was apparently trying to leverage her inside knowledge of hospital operations to negotiate a better deal. "They're both trying to bargain their way out of consequences," Zoe observed. "But they've underestimated how thoroughly you documented their crimes. The prosecutors don't need their cooperation to secure convictions." A week after the arrests, the hospital board met again to discuss the administrative changes needed to prevent similar abuse in the future. I was invited to participate as both a victim of the conspiracy and an expert on the operational vulnerabilities that had allowed it to happen. The meeting was productive, focused on systemic improvements rather than dwelling on the scandal. New oversight protocols were established for personnel investigations, financial authorizations required additional approvals, and a whistleblower protection program was created to encourage staff to report suspicious behavior. Dr. Webb announced that the board was creating a new position, Associate Chief of Staff for Quality Assurance, and asked if I would be interested in the role. The position would involve oversight of patient safety protocols, personnel practices, and operational integrity. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character we need in hospital leadership, Dr. Webb explained. Your experience with this situation, difficult as it was, has given you insights that will help us protect other staff members and maintain the highest standards of professional conduct. The offer was appealing both professionally and personally. Taking on a leadership role would be a clear statement that Nathan and Victoria's conspiracy had failed completely. Instead of destroying my career, their crimes had actually advanced it. But I asked for time to consider the offer. After months of living with deception and betrayal, I wanted to make sure I was making decisions based on my own goals, rather than reacting to what had been done to me. That evening, I sat on my back deck overlooking the Portland skyline, thinking about the path that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a successful surgeon trapped in a marriage built on lies, unaware that the man I trusted most was systematically destroying my life. Now I was free, professionally vindicated, financially secure, and surrounded by genuine support from people who respected my work and character. Nathan and Victoria were facing prison sentences for their crimes, their reputations destroyed, their careers finished. The woman who'd walked into that hospital board meeting prepared to defend herself against false allegations had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to build a life based on truth and integrity. My phone buzzed with a text message from Zoe. Prosecutor says Nathan and Victoria both rejected plea offers. They're going to trial. Are you ready to testify? I looked out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk and felt a familiar surge of determination. Nathan and Victoria had made their choices when they decided to betray me. Now they would face the consequences of those choices in the most public forum possible. I texted back, I'm ready for whatever comes next. And for the first time in months, I truly was. The trial began on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, 3 months after Nathan and Victoria's arrests. The Multnomah County Courthouse was packed with reporters, hospital staff, and curious onlookers who'd followed the scandal through months of pre-trial coverage. I arrived with Zoe, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that projected the same professional competence I wore in the operating room. Nathan sat at the defense table with his attorney, Marcus Whitfield, a high-priced criminal lawyer his parents had hired to minimize the damage to their family's reputation. Victoria sat separately with her own counsel, Jennifer Adams, a public defender who'd drawn the unenviable task of defending someone caught on audio recordings planning criminal acts. The prosecution team was led by District Attorney Rebecca Torres, a formidable woman with a reputation for handling complex white-collar crimes. She'd spent weeks preparing the case, organizing the mountain of evidence into a narrative that even a jury unfamiliar with hospital operations could understand. As the proceedings began, I studied Nathan's appearance. The confident administrator, who'd once commanded respect throughout Riverside General, was gone, replaced by a man who looked older, smaller, diminished by the weight of his exposed crimes. His expensive suit couldn't hide the pallor of someone who'd spent months knowing that prison was inevitable. Victoria appeared defiant, her jaw set in the stubborn expression I remembered from difficult shifts in the cardiac unit. Her attorney had apparently convinced her that fighting the charges was preferable to accepting a plea deal, a decision that struck me as delusional, given the strength of the evidence against her. During opening statements, DA Torres laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision. She described the systematic conspiracy Nathan and Victoria had conducted, using charts and timelines to show how they'd stolen hospital funds while building false cases against their victim. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Torres said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd prosecuted hundreds of criminals. This case is about two people who abused positions of trust to commit theft, fraud, and conspiracy. But more than that, it's about their calculated attempt to destroy an innocent woman's career and reputation to cover their crimes. Marcus Whitfield's opening statement tried to paint Nathan as a man whose judgment had been clouded by an inappropriate relationship, someone who'd made mistakes, but wasn't a criminal mastermind. The strategy was transparent. minimize Nathan's culpability by suggesting he'd been manipulated by Victoria's influence. My client acknowledges that he made serious errors in judgment, Whitfield told the jury. But Nathan Cross is not a criminal. He's a man who allowed personal feelings to affect his professional decisions, who trusted the wrong person, who found himself in a situation that spiraled beyond his control. Jennifer Adams took a different approach for Victoria, arguing that her client had been pressured by Nathan's authority and position. Victoria was portrayed as a young nurse intimidated by a powerful administrator, someone who'd been coerced into participation, rather than being an equal partner in the conspiracy. Victoria Kane is not the mastermind the prosecution wants you to believe, Adams argued. She's a victim herself, a woman who was sexually harassed and professionally manipulated by someone with power over her career. Her actions were the result of duress, not criminal intent. Both defense strategies were predictable but weak, attempting to shift blame while ignoring the clear evidence of premeditation and coordination. The audio recordings alone destroyed any claim that either defendant had been reluctant or coerced. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, with witness after witness detailing Nathan and Victoria's systematic abuse of their positions. Janet Morrison from hospital billing testified about the financial irregularities she'd discovered, her quiet voice steady, as she explained how Nathan had authorized fraudulent payments totaling over $60,000. Dr. Webb took the stand to describe Nathan's abuse of administrative access, his inappropriate involvement in medical decisions, and his violation of patient privacy protocols. The distinguished physician's obvious anger at Nathan's betrayal of trust was palpable, even through his professional restraint. Patricia Woods and other nursing staff testified about Victoria's campaign to undermine my reputation, describing the false incident reports and manufactured complaints that had been designed to build a case for my removal. Their testimony was devastating, showing that Victoria's supposed concern for patient safety had been recognized as manipulation by her own colleagues. David Chen, the forensic accountant, spent an entire day walking the jury through the financial evidence. His methodical presentation showed exactly how Nathan and Victoria had structured their theft, using complex hospital procedures to hide their crimes while enriching themselves at public expense. The most powerful prosecution witness was Dr. Martinez from the emergency department, who testified about the pressure he'd felt to support Nathan's narrative about my supposed performance problems. His description of being asked to review my cases for evidence of declining competence was particularly damaging to Nathan's defense. I was uncomfortable with the request, Dr. Martinez testified. Dr. Donovan's work had always been exemplary, and Mr. Cross's questions seemed designed to find problems rather than assess quality. It felt like he was building a case against her, rather than conducting a legitimate review. When my turn came to testify, I felt the same focused calm that carried me through difficult surgeries. The prosecution had prepared me thoroughly, and Zoe's coaching had readied me for the defense attorney's attempts to undermine my credibility. D.A. Torres walked me through the timeline of discovery, from my first suspicions about Nathan's behavior to the methodical evidence gathering that had exposed their conspiracy. I described finding the divorce papers and separation agreements, discovering the financial fraud, and recording the conversations that proved their criminal intent. Dr. Donovan, Torres asked, when you discovered evidence of your husband's affair and the conspiracy against you, why didn't you confront him immediately? Because I needed to protect myself and gather evidence, I replied. Nathan and Victoria had been planning this for months, building false documentation and preparing false narratives. If I'd confronted them without proof, they would have destroyed evidence and accelerated their timeline. The defense cross-examinations were predictably hostile, with both attorneys trying to portray me as a vindictive wife seeking revenge through false accusations. Marcus Whitfield questioned my methods of evidence gathering, suggesting that recording conversations without consent showed malicious intent rather than self-protection. Dr. Donovan, Whitfield said, his tone implying disapproval. Isn't it true that you secretly recorded private conversations with your husband, violated his privacy, and gathered evidence through deceptive means? I documented criminal activity, I replied firmly. When someone is stealing from their employer and conspiring to destroy your career, gathering evidence isn't deception, it's self-defense. Jennifer Adams took a different approach. trying to suggest that I'd misinterpreted Victoria's legitimate concerns about patient safety as part of a conspiracy. She questioned whether my emotional state following the discovery of Nathan's affair might have colored my perception of Victoria's professional conduct. "Ms. Adams," I said, maintaining my composure despite her implications, "Victoria Kane filed incident reports about procedures she never witnessed, during shifts she wasn't working, about patients she'd never treated. That's not legitimate concern. That's fabrication of evidence." The defense cases were weak and poorly coordinated, with Nathan and Victoria's attorneys sometimes contradicting each other's arguments. Nathan's claim that he'd been manipulated by Victoria conflicted with Victoria's assertion that she'd been coerced by his authority, creating confusion about who had been responsible for initiating the conspiracy. Nathan took the stand in his own defense, a decision that surprised legal observers given the strength of the evidence against him. His testimony was a masterclass in deflection and self-pity, as he attempted to portray himself as a man whose marriage problems had led to poor judgment rather than criminal behavior. "I loved my wife," Nathan testified, his voice breaking with apparent emotion. "But Claire was so focused on her career, so distant from our relationship. When Victoria showed interest in me as a person, not just as an administrator, I was flattered and confused. I made mistakes, but I never intended to hurt anyone." Under cross-examination, DA Torres systematically destroyed Nathan's self-serving narrative. She played audio recordings of him discussing my destruction with cold calculation, showed financial records proving the systematic nature of his theft, and confronted him with evidence that contradicted every aspect of his testimony. "Mr. Cross," Torres said, her voice cutting through his explanations, "you stated that you never intended to hurt anyone. But isn't it true that you and Miss Kane specifically discussed the timeline for destroying your wife's career and reputation?" Nathan's composure cracked under the relentless questioning. His explanations became increasingly desperate as Torres presented evidence that showed the premeditated nature of his crimes. By the end of his cross-examination, even his expensive attorney looked defeated. Victoria chose not to testify, a decision that probably saved her from further incrimination, but left her defense attorney with little to work with, beyond claims of coercion that the evidence clearly contradicted. The closing arguments crystallized the fundamental dishonesty of both defendants' positions. DA Torres used their own recorded words to show the jury exactly who Nathan and Victoria really were: criminals who'd abused positions of trust to enrich themselves while attempting to destroy an innocent woman's life and career. "The defendants want you to believe they were victims of circumstances, people who made mistakes rather than criminals who committed deliberate acts," Torres told the jury. But their own words, recorded in their own voices, tell a different story. These are people who planned crimes, executed those crimes, and showed no remorse until they were caught. The defense attorneys made valiant attempts to create reasonable doubt, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus Whitfield's closing argument for Nathan emphasized his client's previous good reputation and asked for mercy based on his personal problems. Jennifer Adams focused on Victoria's youth and alleged vulnerability to pressure from her supervisor. Both closing arguments felt hollow given the mountain of evidence showing calculated criminal behavior over many months. The jury's expressions suggested they'd already reached their conclusions about the defendant's guilt. Jury deliberation lasted less than 8 hours, a remarkably short time for such a complex case. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces showed the grim satisfaction of people who'd reached a clear verdict based on overwhelming evidence. "On the charge of conspiracy in the first degree, how do you find?" asked the judge. "Guilty," replied the jury foreman, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom. The guilty verdicts continued for all charges: theft, fraud, computer crimes, and conspiracy. Both Nathan and Victoria were convicted on every count, their fate sealed by the evidence they'd never imagined would be discovered and documented. Nathan's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face crumpled as the reality of his situation penetrated his denial, and he began crying openly at the defense table. His parents, sitting in the gallery, looked stunned by the finality of the verdicts, as if they'd somehow expected their money and influence to protect their son from consequences. Victoria remained stoic, her jaw set in defiance even as her future dissolved around her. She stared straight ahead as each guilty verdict was read, refusing to show emotion or acknowledge the magnitude of her crimes. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, giving the court time to prepare pre-sentence reports and allowing both sides to present arguments about appropriate punishment. The prosecution would seek maximum sentences given the breach of public trust involved in the crimes, while the defense would argue for mercy based on the defendant's previous records and personal circumstances. As we left the courthouse that day, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, the truth had been revealed, and Nathan and Victoria would face consequences for their crimes. But there was no celebration in seeing the man I'd once loved destroyed by his own choices, no joy in watching two people face prison sentences for their betrayal. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us with questions about my reaction to the verdicts and my plans for the future. Zoe handled most of the questions, but I made a brief statement about the importance of accountability and the strength of institutions that protect whistleblowers and victims of workplace abuse. This case shows that nobody is above the law, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. People in positions of trust who abuse that trust will be held accountable, regardless of their status or connections. That evening, alone in my new apartment in the Pearl District, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 18 months ago, I'd been a successful surgeon trapped in a marriage built on lies, unaware that the person I trusted most was systematically destroying my life. Now I was free, professionally vindicated, financially secure, and surrounded by colleagues who respected my integrity and character. Nathan and Victoria were facing prison sentences for their crimes, their reputations destroyed, their careers finished forever. The trial had been emotionally exhausting, forcing me to relive months of betrayal and deception in excruciating detail. But it had also been cathartic, providing a public forum where the truth could be told and justice could be served. My phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues, friends, and family members who'd followed the trial coverage. Dr. Webb called to express his satisfaction with the verdicts and to remind me that the hospital board was still hoping I'd accept the associate chief of staff position. The most meaningful message came from Patricia Woods, the nurse who'd first warned me about Victoria's campaign against me. "You did it," her text read. "You protected all of us by standing up to them. Thank you for being stronger than they thought you were." I looked out my apartment window at the Portland skyline, thinking about the future I was now free to build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. But tonight I was simply grateful to be free from the web of lies that had once defined my life. The woman who'd walked into that hospital board meeting 18 months ago had been naive about human nature, trusting to a fault, vulnerable to manipulation by people who saw kindness as weakness. The woman I'd become was wiser, stronger, and absolutely committed to building a life based on truth and integrity. Nathan and Victoria had tried to destroy me, but their betrayal had instead revealed strengths I never knew I possessed. As I prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete peace. The constant anxiety of living with deception was gone, replaced by the clarity that came from truth finally being revealed, and justice finally being served. The trial was over, but my real life was just beginning. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold November morning, 6 weeks after the guilty verdicts had sealed Nathan and Victoria's fates. The same courthouse that had witnessed their conviction now prepared to determine how many years they would spend in prison for their crimes against me and the hospital. I arrived early with Zoe, wanting to deliver my victim impact statement before the formal proceedings began. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial, populated mainly by court personnel, a few reporters, and family members of the defendants who still hoped for judicial mercy despite the overwhelming evidence of guilt. Nathan's parents sat in the front row behind the defense table, Helen's designer coat unable to disguise the way her shoulders had curved inward under the weight of public disgrace. Robert maintained his judicial bearing, but the lines around his eyes had deepened considerably since his son's arrest. The Caldwell family name, built over generations of careful reputation management, had been irreparably tarnished by Nathan's crimes. Victoria's mother had driven up from Eugene, A woman whose weathered hands and simple clothing spoke of a life far removed from the privilege Nathan had enjoyed. She clutched a worn purse and stared at her daughter with a mixture of love and bewilderment, clearly struggling to understand how the nursing school graduate she'd been so proud of had become a convicted felon. Judge Patricia Hernandez had presided over the trial with firm competence, maintaining order, while allowing both sides to present their cases thoroughly. She'd built a reputation for fair but stern sentencing, particularly in cases involving breach of public trust. Her expression suggested she'd given considerable thought to the appropriate punishment for Nathan and Victoria's crimes. The pre-sentence reports had been devastating for both defendants. Nathan's financial situation was completely destroyed. Legal fees had consumed most of his assets. His parents had mortgaged their Lake Oswego home to pay for his defense, and civil judgments from the hospital had left him essentially bankrupt. Victoria faced similar financial ruin, along with the additional burden of student loans from nursing school that would follow her even into prison. DA Torres presented the prosecution's sentencing recommendation first, arguing for maximum penalties based on the calculated nature of the crimes and the defendant's abuse of positions requiring public trust. She emphasized the months of planning that had gone into their conspiracy, the systematic nature of their theft, and their complete lack of remorse until confronted with irrefutable evidence. "Your Honor," Torres said, her voice carrying the weight of justice demanded, "these defendants didn't commit crimes of passion or desperation. They methodically planned and executed a conspiracy designed to enrich themselves while destroying an innocent woman's career and reputation. The breach of trust involved in their crimes requires significant punishment to deter others who might consider similar abuse of their positions." Marcus Whitfield's plea for leniency focused on Nathan's previously clean record, his contributions to hospital administration, and the personal problems that had allegedly led to his poor judgment. He presented character letters from colleagues who'd known Nathan before his crimes, family friends who vouched for his previous integrity, and his parents who begged for mercy for their only son. "Your Honor," Whitfield argued, "Nathan Cross made terrible mistakes, but he's not inherently a criminal. He's a man whose personal problems led him into a situation that spiraled beyond his control. He's lost his career, his marriage, his reputation, and his financial security. He's already paying a significant price for his crimes." Jennifer Adams took a similar approach for Victoria, emphasizing her client's youth, her lack of prior criminal history, and her supposedly vulnerable position as a subordinate employee who'd been pressured by Nathan's authority. She presented letters from nursing school instructors who remembered Victoria as a dedicated student, and from patients who'd appreciated her care during her brief legitimate career. "Ms. Kane is 29 years old, Your Honor," Adams pleaded. "She has her entire life ahead of her. While her actions were wrong, they were the result of manipulation by someone in a position of power over her career. She deserves the chance to rebuild her life and contribute positively to society." Both defense arguments rang hollow given the evidence that had emerged during the trial. The audio recordings had captured Nathan and Victoria as equal partners in their conspiracy, discussing their plans with cold calculation and showing no concern for the damage they were inflicting on their victim or their employer. When Judge Hernandez called for victim impact statements, I stood slowly and walked to the podium. The words I'd prepared over the past weeks felt inadequate to capture the full scope of what Nathan and Victoria had done to my life, but they represented my best attempt to help the court understand the human cost of their crimes. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "Nathan Cross and Victoria Kane didn't just steal money from the hospital or commit fraud against their employer. They systematically attempted to destroy everything I'd worked my entire life to build: my career, my reputation, my financial security, and my faith in the institutions I'd dedicated myself to serving." I described the months of living with subtle undermining and manufactured crises, never knowing that the person I trusted most was orchestrating my professional destruction. The isolation I'd felt as Nathan's conspiracy made me question my own judgment and competence. The terror of realizing that years of careful career building could be destroyed by lies and fabricated evidence. The financial theft was significant, I continued, but the psychological warfare was devastating. They made me doubt myself, question my abilities, and fear that colleagues I respected were losing confidence in my work. They turned my marriage into a weapon against me, using the intimacy and trust I'd given freely as tools for my destruction. I looked directly at Nathan as I spoke, seeing him flinch under the weight of hearing his crimes described in terms of their human impact rather than legal technicalities. The man who'd once promised to love and protect me couldn't meet my eyes as I detailed the damage his betrayal had inflicted. Victoria Kane used her position as a trusted healthcare professional to fabricate evidence and manufacture crises that could have destroyed not just my career, but patient care at our hospital, I said, turning my attention to Nathan's co-conspirator. She perverted the nursing profession's commitment to patient advocacy, using her knowledge of medical procedures to create false documentation that served only her own interests. As I concluded my statement, I felt a profound sense of closure. For over a year, I'd carried the weight of their betrayal in silence, protecting myself while gathering evidence and preparing for this moment of truth. Now finally, the full scope of their crimes was being acknowledged in the most formal and public way possible. I've rebuilt my life and career despite their attempts to destroy both, I finished. But others might not be as fortunate. The sentences you impose today will send a message about whether positions of trust can be abused without serious consequences. I trust this court to ensure that message protects future victims and upholds the integrity of our institutions. Judge Hernandez listened intently to my statement, occasionally taking notes on the legal pad before her. When I returned to my seat, she asked both defendants if they wished to address the court before sentencing. The responses revealed everything about their characters and their understanding of their crimes. Nathan chose to speak, rising unsteadily from the defense table with a prepared statement that his attorney had obviously helped craft. His words were a masterpiece of deflection and self-pity, acknowledging wrongdoing while avoiding responsibility for the deliberate nature of his actions. "Your Honor," Nathan said, his voice shaking with what appeared to be genuine emotion, "I want to express my deepest regret for the pain I've caused. My marriage to Claire was the most important thing in my life, and I destroyed it through my own weakness and poor judgment. I allowed personal problems to cloud my professional responsibilities, and I deeply regret the choices that led us to this courtroom." He continued for several minutes, describing his remorse and his desire to make amends, his commitment to rebuilding his life, and contributing positively to society. But his statement carefully avoided acknowledging the calculated nature of his conspiracy, or accepting full responsibility for the damage he'd inflicted. Victoria remained silent when offered the chance to speak, staring straight ahead with the same defiant expression she'd maintained throughout the trial. Her refusal to acknowledge her crimes or express remorse for their impact spoke volumes about her character and her understanding of the situation. Judge Hernandez took a brief recess to review the sentencing guidelines and consider the arguments presented by both sides. When court resumed, she delivered sentences that reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the need to deter similar abuse of public trust. "Nathan Cross," she said, her voice carrying the authority of the judicial system, "you held a position requiring the highest standards of integrity and public trust. You systematically abused that position to enrich yourself and your co-conspirator, while attempting to destroy an innocent woman's career and reputation. Your crimes were not momentary lapses in judgment, but carefully planned and executed over many months." Nathan's shoulders slumped as Judge Hernandez continued, describing the aggravating factors that justified a significant sentence. His abuse of administrative access, his theft of public funds, his manipulation of medical records, and his breach of fiduciary duty all contributed to the severity of his punishment. "I sentence you to 7 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation," Judge Hernandez announced. "You will also pay full restitution to Riverside General Hospital and to Dr. Donovan for the financial damages caused by your crimes." Nathan's parents audibly gasped at the sentence, Helen beginning to cry quietly into her handkerchief. Nathan himself seemed to deflate completely, the reality of spending his 40s in prison finally penetrating his denial and self-deception. Victoria's sentence was equally severe, reflecting her equal partnership in the conspiracy and her complete lack of remorse for her actions. Judge Hernandez sentenced her to 6 years in state prison, with 3 years of probation, acknowledging her slightly lesser role in the financial aspects, while emphasizing the seriousness of her abuse of her nursing position. Victoria Kane, the judge said, you perverted your professional obligations as a healthcare provider to serve your own interests. Your fabrication of medical evidence and false documentation could have endangered patient care while destroying a colleague's reputation. Your crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in medical professionals. Victoria showed no reaction to her sentence, maintaining the stoic expression she'd worn throughout the proceedings. Her mother's quiet sobs were the only sound in the courtroom, as the full weight of her daughter's choices became clear. Both defendants were remanded into custody immediately, their brief freedom during the trial proceedings coming to an end as bailiffs prepared to transport them to state prison. Nathan looked back at his parents one last time, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation, before being led away in handcuffs. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for final statements from the prosecution and defense teams. DA Torres expressed satisfaction with the sentences, emphasizing that they sent a clear message about the consequences of abusing positions of public trust. The defense attorneys made perfunctory statements about considering appeals, though the strength of the evidence made successful appeals unlikely. I gave a brief statement emphasizing my relief that justice had been served, and my hope that the case would deter others from similar abuse of their positions. The questions from reporters focused on my future plans, and whether I felt the sentences were appropriate given the crimes. No sentence can undo the damage Nathan and Victoria inflicted, I said, but these punishments reflect the seriousness of their crimes, and the importance of protecting institutions that serve the public. I'm grateful for a justice system that holds people accountable regardless of their status or connections. The civil lawsuits proceeded more quickly than the criminal case, with Nathan and Victoria's obvious guilt making financial recovery straightforward. The hospital's insurance covered most of the stolen funds, but both defendants remained personally liable for damages to my reputation and career. Nathan's financial situation made meaningful recovery unlikely. His assets had been consumed by legal fees, and his parents' resources were similarly depleted. Victoria had even fewer assets, facing decades of debt from both restitution orders and her student loans. But the civil judgments served an important symbolic purpose, creating permanent legal records of the financial damage their crimes had caused. The documents would follow both defendants for the rest of their lives, ensuring that their criminal behavior had lasting consequences beyond their prison sentences. 3 months after the sentencing, I accepted the Associate Chief of Staff position at Riverside General Hospital. The role represented both professional advancement and personal vindication. Instead of destroying my career, Nathan and Victoria's conspiracy had ultimately elevated it by demonstrating my integrity and resilience under extraordinary pressure. The position allowed me to implement systemic changes that would prevent similar abuse in the future. New oversight protocols for personnel investigations, enhanced financial controls, and whistleblower protection programs that encourage staff to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. Dr. Webb remained a valuable mentor as I transitioned into hospital leadership, his support during the darkest period of the conspiracy, having forged a professional relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to institutional integrity. You've shown exactly the kind of character we need in healthcare leadership, he told me during one of our regular meetings. Your experience, difficult as it was, has given you insights that will make you more effective in protecting both patients and staff. The nursing staff who'd supported me during Victoria's campaign of false accusations became some of my strongest allies in the new role. Patricia Woods was promoted to charge nurse in the cardiac unit, her loyalty and integrity during the conspiracy having demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the department needed. 6 months after beginning my new position, I received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. Helen Cross appeared in my office unannounced, looking older and more fragile than I remembered from the trial proceedings. Her designer clothes couldn't disguise the toll that her son's crimes and imprisonment had taken on her health and spirit. "Claire," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with obvious difficulty, "I wanted to apologize for what Nathan did to you. I know an apology can't undo the damage, but I needed you to know that some of us understand how wrong he was." The conversation was awkward but necessary, A final acknowledgement from Nathan's family that their son's actions had been indefensible. Helen described the impact his crimes had had on their family, the social ostracism, the financial strain, the shame of having their name associated with such calculated betrayal. "We raised him better than this," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "I don't know where we went wrong, how he became someone capable of such cruelty. But I want you to know that we don't blame you for what happened to him. He made his choices, and he's paying the consequences." I accepted her apology graciously, recognizing that Helen was trying to salvage some dignity from her family's disgrace while acknowledging the reality of her son's crimes. The conversation provided closure for both of us, a final chapter in the story that had defined so much of the previous 2 years. A year after the sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney from Nathan in prison. The handwritten pages were filled with apologies and expressions of remorse, along with detailed explanations of his mental state during the conspiracy and his current commitment to personal growth and rehabilitation. Reading Nathan's letter was surreal. The man who'd systematically betrayed me was now asking for forgiveness, describing his crimes as the result of depression, anxiety, and feelings of inadequacy that had driven him to make destructive choices. His explanations were probably sincere, but they couldn't change the calculated nature of his actions or the damage they'd inflicted. I chose not to respond to Nathan's letter, feeling that any communication would only serve his emotional needs, while providing nothing beneficial for my own healing process. Some betrayals were simply too profound to forgive, regardless of the perpetrator's subsequent remorse or rehabilitation. Victoria never attempted to contact me, maintaining the defiant silence she'd shown throughout the legal proceedings. According to news reports, she'd adapted poorly to prison life, facing additional disciplinary actions for violating institutional rules and refusing to participate in rehabilitation programs. 2 years after their sentencing, I had fully established myself in the Associate Chief of Staff role and was being considered for the Chief of Staff position when Dr. Webb announced his retirement. The prospect of leading the hospital where I'd endured such systematic betrayal felt like the ultimate vindication of my decision to fight rather than flee. My personal life had also stabilized in ways I hadn't expected. The trauma of Nathan's betrayal had initially made me suspicious of romantic relationships, but gradually I'd begun dating again, meeting people who appreciated my strength and independence, rather than seeing them as threats to be neutralized. Dr. James Sullivan, an emergency medicine physician who joined Riverside General a year after the scandal, had become a close friend, and eventually something more. His straightforward personality and complete lack of political ambition provided a sharp contrast to Nathan's calculated manipulation and hidden agendas. "You know what I love most about you?" James said one evening as we watched the sunset from my apartment balcony. "You're completely authentic. What I see is what I get. No hidden agendas, no secret plans, no manipulation. After what you went through, lesser people would have become bitter and suspicious. Instead, you became stronger and more committed to truth." The relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than the intense attraction and calculated courtship that had characterized my marriage to Nathan. I'd learned to value consistency over charm, integrity over charisma, and genuine partnership over performative devotion. 3 years after Nathan and Victoria's sentencing, I was named Chief of Staff at Riverside General Hospital. The appointment represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward throughout my medical career, achieved not despite the conspiracy against me but because of how I'd handled it. The announcement generated significant media attention, with several articles describing my journey from victim of workplace conspiracy to hospital leadership. The coverage emphasized the institutional changes I'd implemented and the culture of accountability I'd fostered, presenting my story as an example of how individual resilience could drive systemic improvement. During my acceptance speech to the hospital board, I reflected on the path that had brought me to this moment. From the naive surgeon who'd trusted too easily to the experienced leader who'd learned to verify while still maintaining faith in institutional integrity. Leadership isn't about avoiding betrayal or conspiracy, I told the assembled board members and staff. It's about building systems and cultures that expose such behavior quickly and protect those who report it. The experiences that tested this institution's integrity ultimately made us stronger and more committed to our mission of serving patients and supporting each other. The speech received a standing ovation from colleagues who'd witnessed my journey from victim to victor, from someone who'd been systematically undermined to someone now responsible for preventing similar attacks on others. 5 years after the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed my life, I stood in the same hospital boardroom where I'd exposed Nathan and Victoria's crimes, now leading the institution they'd tried to use as a weapon against me. The irony was perfect. Their attempt to eliminate me from Riverside General had instead positioned me to lead it. Nathan and Victoria were halfway through their prison sentences, their early release dependent on good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. Nathan had apparently embraced prison education opportunities, earning college credits, and participating in counseling programs. Victoria remained defiant and uncooperative, facing additional time for disciplinary infractions. I rarely thought about either of them anymore. My attention focused on building, rather than dwelling on destruction. The conspiracy that had once consumed my life had become simply one chapter in a larger story of professional growth, personal strength, and institutional improvement. The woman who'd lain in that hospital bed 6 years earlier, abandoned by her husband while recovering from surgery, had been naive about human nature and vulnerable to manipulation by people who mistook kindness for weakness. The woman I'd become understood that strength sometimes required ruthless action to protect what mattered most. My life was fuller and more meaningful than it had ever been during my marriage to Nathan. Professional success built on genuine merit rather than connections, personal relationships based on honesty rather than calculation, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that I'd not only survived betrayal, but had emerged stronger and more committed to the values that defined me. As I prepared to leave my office that evening, I looked out the window at the Portland skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. The city lights twinkled in the gathering dusk, each one representing lives and dreams and challenges that required the kind of institutional integrity I was now positioned to protect. My phone buzzed with a text from James, asking if I wanted to grab dinner before heading home. The simple question represented everything that had changed in my life. Genuine care without hidden agendas, partnership without power struggles, love without manipulation. I gathered my things and headed toward the elevator, leaving behind another day of honest work, in service of patients and colleagues who deserved nothing less than complete integrity from their leaders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference, new chances to demonstrate that truth and character ultimately triumph over conspiracy and betrayal. The woman Nathan and Victoria had tried to destroy was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and absolutely committed to ensuring that what they'd done to me could never happen to anyone else under my watch. Their conspiracy had failed completely, but the strength it had revealed in me would benefit this institution and its people for years to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.